Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a close look at something that might sound a bit obscure: ferruginous deposits.
Yeah, basically that's just the fancy term for rocks or sediments that have a lot of iron oxides in them.
Iron oxides. Like rust.
Sort of like rust, yeah. Think of them as rusty bits of the earth found all over the world in, well, countless different forms.
Exactly. And the focus of our deep dive today is a recent study that zoomed in on these deposits in a very specific ancient setting: Central Saudi Arabia. Now, when you picture Saudi Arabia, you probably think of sand dunes and heat.
Right. Not giant ice sheets and glacial meltwater, which is actually the kind of environment these particular rocks were formed in.
That's the hook. Here's where it gets really interesting. The rocks studied in this paper tell us about Earth's deep past specifically, a major period of glaciation around, 440 million years ago?
That's right. During the late Ordovician period, this area that's now desert was part of the supercontinent Gondwana back then and was covered in ice. A very different picture. And these iron deposits, they formed within or alongside the sandstones that were laid down during and just after that icy time.
So it's a geological puzzle then. How did so much iron get concentrated in rocks from a glacial environment in a place that's now a desert?
Exactly. But the story doesn't end there, actually.
No.
Understanding how these specific iron-rich features form on Earth in this rather unique, ancient, glaciated landscape, it actually gives us crucial clues for interpreting similar features found, well, on another planet.
Let me guess. Mars.
You got it, Mars. The red planet is red because of iron oxides, and there are particular iron-rich structures there that scientists are, really trying hard to understand.
Like those Santa's blueberries.
Precisely, the hematite blueberries found by Opportunity.
Okay, so our mission for this deep dive, we're going to unpack the key findings from this study. We'll figure out what kinds of these iron-rich deposits were found in Saudi Arabia, where exactly they were located, what they're made of.
And critically, where did all that iron come from? How did these different shapes and forms develop?
Right. And maybe most importantly, why does studying these ancient rusty rocks in Saudi Arabia actually matter for understanding both our own planet and potentially Mars?
Sounds like a plan. Let's jump in.
So when we talk about ferruginous deposits in the context of this study, what exactly did they find? You said various forms. It wasn't just one type, right?
Not at all, no. This study found a whole range. Ferruginous deposits, again, just meaning sediments or rocks with high concentrations of iron oxides. They found features like solid concretions, those hard sort of rounded lumps you might picture.
Okay, solid ones?
Or rinded concretions, which are similar lumps, but they have a distinct iron-rich outer shell or rind.
Right, like a crust.
Exactly. They also saw pipes, which are these elongated features, sometimes running vertically through the rock layers.
And layers, too.
Yep, layers, which are pretty much what they sound like: iron-rich bands or beds within the rock strata.
Okay.
Ferrucretes, which are really hard, almost like pavement layers, where iron oxide has strongly cemented the sediment together.
Like iron concrete.
Sort of, yeah. And leastgang bands, those are often colorful, curved, or concentric patterns you sometimes see when, you slice open a rock.
Oh, those are beautiful sometimes.
They can be. And finally, simple fracture infills, where iron oxides have just cemented cracks in the rock.
So quite a gallery of iron features, really.
It really is. And the study notes these forms vary widely in size and their exact composition. While, as we said, iron-rich deposits are globally widespread, what makes this study unique is its focus on this specific ancient setting: sandstones laid down during or influenced by that late Ordovician glacial period.
Which leads us right to where in Saudi Arabia these features were discovered.
Yeah.
Central Saudi Arabia, you mentioned.
Right, Central Saudi Arabia. The main geological formation they investigated is called the Sera Formation.
The Sera Formation.
And it dates back to that late Ordovician glacial period, specifically the Hernanchian stage. Geologists call this glaciogenic because it was formed directly by glaciers or related meltwater processes.
So these are literally the rocks left behind by that ancient ice age. That's amazing.
It really is. They also looked at the very top sections of some older formations just beneath the Sera Formation.
Okay.
These were not glaciogenic, though. They were formed before the Ice Age in different environments, like a shallow marine environment called the Quara member, and river deltas, braided deltaic systems, in the Sajir member.
So think of these older layers as the ground the glaciers eventually covered or dumped sediment on.
That's a good way to picture it, yeah.
And because this area was part of Gondwana, it was actually at a latitude that made glaciation possible, even though, like we said, it's scorching hot desert today. It's just mind-bending.
It really is. Now, the study was very specific about where they found different types of deposits within these formations, those deformed layers we mentioned.
Yeah.
They were mainly in areas thought to be subglacial, meaning directly beneath the ice, likely squeezed and, contorted by the ice flow itself.
Okay, makes sense. And the rinded concretions, the ones with the crust.
They found those in what are called bleached glaciofluvial facies of the Serra Formation.
Glaciofluvial, meaning meltwater streams.
Exactly, deposited by streams flowing from the glacier.
Yeah?
And bleached here refers to areas where the original iron minerals seem to have been removed, leaving the sand lighter colored. That's actually important for understanding how the iron later moved into other spots to form these features.
Ah, okay. So the removal happened first. What about the solid concretions?
Oddly enough, they found those mostly in that older, non-glacial, shallow marine Kawara member.
Huh. So some forms are specific to the glacial rocks, but others show up in the older ones too. It's not a simple split.
No, it isn't simple. Pites, for example, showed up in both the older Sajur member and parts of the Serra Formation.
And those beautiful Leesgang bands.
They only showed up in the older, shallow marine Kawara member, according to this study.
Interesting. But it sounds like the glaciogenic Serra Formation overall still had a higher concentration of these iron features compared to the older ones they looked at.
Yes, that was definitely a key observation the study highlighted. More iron action in the glacial deposits.
Okay, so we have a picture of what they look like and where they sit in the landscape, both geographically and geologically. Now, the science bit. What are these iron-rich deposits actually made of? Chemically, mineralogically.
Right. So the study used detailed mineral analysis, techniques like X-ray diffraction or XRD.
That tells you the crystal structure, right, what minerals are there.
Exactly. And their big finding was that the primary iron oxide mineral in all the ferruginous deposits they studied was goethite.
Goethite, okay, I've heard of that, but not hematite, which is probably the more famous iron oxide, the stuff that makes Mars red.
Correct. Goethite was dominant here. It mainly acts as cement, filling in the tiny pore spaces between the sand grains. They did find hematite occasionally, but only in one specific location out of all the sites they sampled.
So mostly goethite cement. What else was mixed in? Anything?
Often clay minerals, things like kaolinite primarily, sometimes elite. They also found calcite cement in other parts of the rock, but it seemed separate from the iron features.
Okay. And what about their geochemical analysis? They used micro X-ray fluorescence, XRF. What did that show?
Well, that confirmed high iron concentrations in the iron-rich features, the concretions, layers, bands, and so on, as you'd expect.
Right.
And they saw iron was often associated with manganese. Interestingly, elements like calcium, K, and sulfur, S, were typically found in those bleached areas we talked about, the parts without the heavy iron stain or associated with the calcite features.
Suggesting minerals like gypsum, maybe? Calcium sulfate?
Potentially, yes, suggesting gypsum might be present in those non-iron zones. So the iron seems to be spatially separate from the calcium and sulfur enrichment.
And the mineral analysis backed that up.
It did, yes.
Oh.
The XRD analysis showed that the ferruginous concretions didn't contain calcite, and conversely, the calcite concretions didn't contain iron oxide minerals. They seem to be distinct features forming separately.
Okay, that's clear. So how did all this goethite-rich iron get into these sediments in the first place? Where did it actually come from?
Good question. The study proposes the source was the ancient basement rocks of the Arabian Shield.
The Shield. Those are really old, igneous, and metamorphic rocks deep down.
Exactly. Ancient rocks that contain various iron-bearing minerals.
Like mafic and ultramafic rocks. Those are rich in iron and magnesium.
Precisely. So that's the likely ultimate source. But then the question is, how did weathered bits from those ancient shield rocks get transported all the way to the sandstones in the basin, potentially hundreds of kilometers away?
Okay, yeah. How did that happen? This is where the glaciation comes back in, isn't it?
Absolutely. The late Ordovician glaciation, the Hernanchian event, and the massive process of deglaciation, the melting and retreat of those huge ice sheets essentially acted as the transport system.
Glaciers are like giant conveyor belts grinding stuff up and moving it.
Incredibly powerful ones, yes. So the ice sheets would have eroded weathered fragments from the Arabian Shield pieces of those iron-bearing rocks, maybe even bits of laterite soils that had formed from intense weathering periods earlier and carried them along with the ice.
Or in the meltwater.
or incorporated them into the massive amounts of meltwater produced as the glaciers retreated. This material, containing the iron, was then deposited alongside the sandstones in the basin. The study even references a conceptual diagram, figure 17 in the paper, illustrating this long-distance transport process driven by the ice.
So the iron wasn't necessarily in its final form, like goethite concretions, when it was transported?
Probably not, no. The iron was likely transported in various forms, perhaps incorporated into clay minerals or other less stable phases within the sediment initially.
Okay.
The concentration and oxidation of this iron into the stable goethite form, creating the distinct deposits we see today that probably happened later, after the sediments were deposited, through the movement of iron-rich fluids within the buried sediment.
Which leads us perfectly to the next puzzle.
Hmm.
How did these different shapes, the concretions, the pipes, the layers, how did they actually form after the iron got there and was oxidized? What controlled that?
Yeah, this is where it gets complex and really fascinating. Once the iron was present in the sediments, maybe dissolved in pore water, the specific form it took as it precipitated out was controlled by several interacting factors.
Such as, like the characteristics of the rock itself.
Exactly. Things like the host rock lithology, what the sandstone was made of, its grain size, its texture, and crucially, its porosity and permeability.
Porosity being the empty space, permeability, how easily fluids flow through.
You got it. Basically, how much empty space was in the rock and how well connected those spaces were. Where fluids could move easily, iron could be deposited more readily, often following specific flow paths.
Environmental conditions played a role too, I assume.
A big one. Factors like temperature, how much moisture was present, the pH level, the acidity or alkalinity of the pore water, and critically, the redox state.
Redox, meaning the availability of oxygen.
Yeah.
Whether conditions were oxidizing or reducing.
Precisely. All these chemical conditions would have heavily influenced where and how the iron precipitated to form these different features, concretions here, layers there, pipes somewhere else.
So maybe you could imagine iron-rich water, perhaps left over from the retreating glacier or later groundwater, seeping through the most permeable parts of the sediment.
Right.
And where the chemical conditions were just right, perhaps where it met oxygen, the iron precipitated out.
That's a very plausible way to think about it, yes. Following preferential flow paths in the sediment is likely how the iron got distributed before it solidified into these distinct shapes we see now.
Now, you mentioned earlier that concretion formation itself is actually a bit of a debated topic among scientists. What's the core puzzle there? Why isn't it straightforward?
Well, it is debated mainly because concretions show up in so many different geological settings around the world, formed under different conditions, and they show a lot of variety. So the exact process can vary quite a bit. Existing models suggest things like iron minerals directly coating existing sand grains and cementing them together, or maybe iron replacing other minerals that formed earlier, like siderite, which is an iron carbonate, or even replacing carbonate concretions.
Different pathways.
Exactly. But as this study points out, none of these single models seem to perfectly explain all the diversity of concretions seen globally, including the different types and features they documented there in Saudi Arabia.
So it suggests multiple factors are at play.
It really does. It suggests that multiple factors and maybe multiple pathways are possible, depending heavily on the specific local conditions. The host rock, the specific fluids involved, the chemistry, the timing of events in the geological history. It's not a one-size-fits-all explanation.
Right. Context is everything in geology.
Absolutely. The host rock, the fluids, the chemistry, the timing, it all matters.
All right, let's zoom out a bit then. Why go through all this incredibly detailed geological detective work on ancient iron-rich rocks in a Saudi Arabian desert? Why compare them to other rocks, including, fascinatingly, those on Mars? Why should you, our listener, care about goethite concretions?
Well, there are a couple of really big reasons highlighted by the study. First, and perhaps the most exciting one for many people, is the Mars exploration angle.
Right.
Earth is essentially the best natural laboratory we have for understanding geological processes that might happen or might have happened on other planets. And since Mars is literally the red planet covered in iron oxides.
It makes sense to study Earth's iron oxides.
Exactly. Studying how these features form in different Earth environments, including this unique ancient glaciated setting, provides essential context for interpreting what we see on Mars with our rovers and orbiters.
Like those Mars blueberries found by the Opportunity rover, those are small, spherical iron oxide concretions too, aren't they?
They are very famous ones. The Mars blueberries are made of hematite, though, and they're typically pretty small, maybe 3 to 6 millimeters across.
Okay, so different mineralogy hematite versus the goethite found here.
Huh.
And size.
And size, yes. The Saudi solid concretions described in this study are mostly goethite. They seem less abundant overall, and they're often kind of fused together or amalgamated. That contrasts with, say, hematite concretions found in the Wajid sandstone elsewhere in Saudi Arabia, which are more abundant, or the very abundant ones in the Navajo sandstone in the U.S., which are also hematite.
So differences are important, but the comparison is still valuable. It helps us ask the right questions about Mars.
Immensely valuable, yes. Seeing hematite on Mars versus goethite in these Saudi glacial rocks immediately makes us think. Did they form under different conditions? Did the hematite on Mars precipitate directly from ancient water bodies? Or maybe did goethite form first through later alteration by water and then perhaps transform to hematite?
Ah, so it gets into the timing and nature of water on Mars.
Precisely. Comparing the features on Mars to different Earth analogs, like these Saudi goethite concretions from a specific glacial setting versus other hematite examples from different environments, helps us piece together Mars's geological history and evaluate the role water played there. And that's absolutely fundamental to the search for whether Mars could have once supported life.
And this study highlighted some truly unique features in Saudi Arabia compared to other places, didn't it?
Yeah.
Especially those rinded concretions you mentioned.
Yes, they really did. Some of those rinded concretions exposed in road cuts were huge. The paper mentions them being up to 2 meters across.
Wow, 2 meters. That's less of a blueberry and more of a rusty boulder.
Definitely not blueberry size.
Wow.
And using detailed scans, like CT scans, the study showed these giant rinded concretions had intricate internal structures, including small concretions visible actually on their rind surface.
What did that mean?
They interpreted this as indicating a mature or complex internal growth process. This unique texture and sheer size isn't typically seen in well-known examples from places like the Netherlands or even the famous Navajo sandstone concretions.
So it hints that the specific conditions in this ancient Saudi glacial environment led to a different, perhaps prolonged growth process.
Exactly. And that kind of detailed observation and comparison is invaluable for comparative planetology, understanding the range of possibilities.
Okay. And the pipes and layers, how do they compare?
Well, the pipes looked similar in general shape or morphology to pipes seen in places like the Navajo or Chinle formations in the U.S. Southwest, but again, compositionally different goethite versus hematite predominantly.
Right.
And the layers and Leesgang bands in Saudi Arabia showed these clear zones of high iron concentration that sharply decreased into adjacent bleached or just stained areas. This gives clues about how the fluids moved and where the iron precipitated out. It might differ subtly from other definitions where bands are sometimes described simply as coatings on grains rather than pore-filling cement.
Okay, so the Mars connection is clear and really compelling. What's the other main application? You mentioned 2 big reasons.
The second application is much more down to earth. Quite literally, resource evaluation.
Ah, practical stuff.
Very practical. Sandstones like the one studied here are often targeted by industry as potential reservoirs for oil and gas, or, critically, as aquifers holding precious groundwater resources, especially in arid regions like Saudi Arabia.
Okay, and if the pore spaces, the gaps between the sand grains, are filled up with this hard iron oxide cement,
Then the porosity, the amount of empty space available to hold oil, gas, or water, and the permeability, how easily those fluids can actually flow through the rock, are significantly reduced.
makes sense. It clogs up the rock.
It clogs it up, exactly. This directly degrades the quality of that sandstone as a potential reservoir or aquifer. The study mentions the Wajid sandstone again as a real-world example, where these iron oxides are known to negatively impact reservoir quality and subsurface exploration.
So for anyone exploring for water or hydrocarbons in these kinds of rocks, understanding where these iron patches are, how extensive they are, what type they are, that's crucial information.
Absolutely critical. It's vital for correctly interpreting data from subsurface tools like well logging instruments. For example, resistivity logs, which measure how well rocks conduct electricity, can be strongly affected by the presence of conductive minerals like iron oxides.
So if you don't account for that,
If you don't understand where and how the iron is distributed, you could easily misinterpret the log data and make inaccurate assessments about how much water or oil might be in the ground or how easily it could be extracted. You might drill in the wrong place or misjudge the potential.
So, okay, there you have it. We've journeyed from defining these ferruginous deposits.
To placing them in the surprising context of an ancient, once glaciated landscape in central Saudi Arabia, uncovering their predominantly goethite composition and tracing their likely source back to distant shield rocks transported by, believe it or not, ice and meltwater.
We've explored how their varied forms, concretions, pipes, layers likely developed, influenced by the host rock properties and the surrounding chemical environment, and even touched on the ongoing scientific debate about how exactly concretions form, noting the unique characteristics of these specific Saudi examples.
And finally, we've seen why comparing these detailed findings to other Earth sites, and crucially to features observed on Mars, offers really profound insights for both planetary science, understanding the history of water on Mars, and practical applications like managing vital water and energy resources right here on Earth.
It's fascinating. This study gives us a really unique window into how iron behaves in these glaciogenic settings, adding crucial detail to our understanding of similar features found around the world, and maybe most intriguingly, helping us interpret the geological history and, well, the potential for past water on Mars.
It's a powerful reminder, isn't it? That seemingly simple things like rusty stains on a rock or odd shapes like concretions can hold incredibly complex clues.
Clues not just about the deep, deep past of our own planet, but about the fundamental processes shaping geological landscapes, even on other worlds billions of miles away.
It definitely makes you wonder what other common geological quirks or features are out there just waiting for us to look closely enough to tell us secrets about the cosmos.